She was 20 years old the morning she stood on the porch of the only house she had ever known, and watched a stranger nail an auction notice to the post where her mother used to hang drying herbs. Her uncle, Silas Voss, had signed away the family's claim the week after her father's funeral, and now he stood behind her with his hat already on, telling her that a grown woman with 2 working hands owed nobody her keep. She had $9 sewn into the hem of her coat, a tin of her father's tools, and a red-coated hound named Copper pressed so tightly against her leg that she could feel him trembling. 3 days later, in the town of Larkspur, Colorado Territory, she paid 4 of those dollars for a windowless stone building nobody else wanted, the old powder magazine of the played-out Silver Star mine, sealed shut since the day the mine closed. Folks called it foolish money thrown at a tomb. They did not know that behind its sealed door waited a secret that would not just change one orphaned woman's fortune, but call an entire wronged town back from ruin. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adelia Voss and her faithful dog Copper. If this story of quiet courage and an even more quietly faithful dog finds a home in your heart tonight, tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and let Copper know he has friends everywhere. Adelia Voss had been born in the spring of 1869, in a cabin at the foot of Larkspur Ridge, in a year when the Silver Star mine was still new and hungry, and the whole town smelled of fresh-cut pine and hope. Her father, Tobias Voss, was the mine's blacksmith, a broad, quiet man, whose hands could shape a horseshoe, or mend a child's broken toy with the same unhurried care, and her mother, Ruth, kept a small dressmaking trade out of their front room, her needle flashing by lamplight, long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep. It was from her mother that Adelia learned patience, the kind that could hold 100 small stitches in mind at once, and still find peace in the doing of it. And it was from her father that she learned the deeper lesson of his trade, that the value of a thing was never in how it looked when you first laid eyes on it, but in what it was built to hold, and to become, under the right hands and the right fire. He used to tell her, turning a blackened, unremarkable lump of iron over in his palm before the forge took it, that the world was full of people too quick to throw away what merely looked plain. She carried that sentence with her, the way other children carried a favorite marble, worn smooth from handling, and it would return to her, whole and unbidden, in the hardest year of her life. The dog came to her the winter she turned 11, in the shape of a half-starved, copper-red pup, no bigger than a loaf of bread, found shivering under the porch during a blizzard that had buried Larkspur under 3 feet of snow. Tobias wanted to leave him be, certain the pup belonged to some miner's family up the ridge, but Adelia would not hear of it, and she sat on the cold boards with her coat spread over the shaking animal, until her father relented, and carried them both inside. No owner ever came looking. The pup grew into a lean, handsome hound, with a nose that seemed to know the shape of the wind before it arrived, and Adelia named him Copper, for the color of his coat, and for the copper kettle her mother always kept warming on the stove, because to an 11-year-old girl, warmth and copper had become the same word. In those early months, he was more trouble than comfort, chewing through a good pair of her father's gloves, and treeing the neighbors' chickens with an enthusiasm no scolding seemed to dampen, and it was Ruth Voss who first noticed that beneath the mischief ran a deeper, steadier thread, that the pup would go still and quiet the moment Adelia herself grew still and quiet, matching her moods the way a shadow matches a body, long before he had learned to sit or heel on command. Tobias built him a low wooden box lined with an old quilt to sleep beside the forge on the coldest nights, and by spring, the whole household had simply stopped pretending the arrangement was temporary. From that winter forward, the two of them were rarely more than a room's length apart. He slept across the foot of her bed through every fever of her childhood, walked beside her cart on market days with the solemn dignity of a much older animal, and learned, without ever being taught in any formal way, to read the smallest changes in her voice. A skill that would, in the fullness of time, prove to be worth more than any inheritance her family could have left her. Larkspur itself grew up around the Silver Star, the way a town grows up around any vein of ore, rich enough to promise a future. Quickly, crookedly, full of families, who had come from somewhere else entirely, to bet everything on a hole in a mountain. The mine's owner, a soft-spoken Boston financier named Cornelius Wexler, was rarely seen in town himself, preferring to leave the daily running of things to a bookkeeper named Elias Thorne, a narrow, careful man who had once, in his younger years, served as the Powder magazine's keeper, before he was promoted to the company office. Thorne was known around Larkspur as an honest oddity, a company man, who nonetheless tipped his hat to every miner's wife by name, and who was seen, more than once, quietly slipping a coin to a family whose husband had been hurt underground. Adelia's father trusted him, and so, by extension, did she. It was Thorne who taught the young Adelia, on slow afternoons, when she brought her father's supper to the smithy, how to read a ledger, the neat columns of debits and credits, the way a single number, honestly recorded, could stand as a kind of promise between two people. She did not know, then, how much that small kindness would matter to her one day, nor how the very structure of numbers he had shown her how to read would become the thread she pulled to unravel everything. For 9 years, life in Larkspur held its shape. The Silver Star produced steadily if not spectacularly. The town grew a schoolhouse, and a proper church, and a mercantile with real glass windows, and Adelia grew from a solemn child into a capable young woman known for mending harness leather as well as any man in the county, and for a hound at her heel that every child in town claimed, with varying degrees of accuracy, as a personal friend. Then, in the autumn of Adelia's 20th year, the vein gave out. It happened the way these things always seem to happen in mining country, not gradually, with warning, but all at once, as though the mountain itself had simply changed its mind. The Silver Star's assay reports came back thin 3 months running, and within a season, the mine that had built the town announced, through a terse notice pinned to the mercantile door, that it was ceasing operations. Cornelius Wexler did not come to deliver the news himself. He sent it by telegram, and then he and his ledgers and his company simply vanished east, leaving behind unpaid wages, a town full of frightened families, and a locked, silent mineshaft that had, until that autumn, been the only heartbeat Larkspur had ever known. Tobias Voss did not live to see the worst of it. In the scramble of the mine's final weeks, when half the remaining crew was sent below to salvage what equipment could be sold before the shafts were sealed, a support timber gave way in a passage that had not been properly shored in months, and Adelia's father was among the 3 men who did not come back up. Ruth Voss, who had never in 20 years of marriage spent more than a handful of nights apart from her husband, followed him into the ground before the following spring thaw, worn through by grief and a lingering fever that the town's overworked doctor could not turn back. Adelia buried both her parents within the same 6 months, on the same hillside, with Copper sitting silent and watchful at the edge of each grave, and she told herself, in the numb, mechanical way a person tells themselves anything, just to keep standing upright, that she still had the house, and the smithy tools, and whatever the family had managed to save. The town did what small towns do, in the face of a grief too large for any one family to carry alone. It brought over stew and bread it could ill afford to spare, it sat with her through the worst nights, and old Mr. Abernathy at the mercantile quietly extended credit he never expected to see repaid. But kindness, however genuine, does not restore a mother or a father, and Adelia moved through those first weeks with a strange hollow steadiness, feeding Copper before she remembered to feed herself, latching the smithy door each evening out of habit, though there was no longer anyone inside for it to keep safe. She did not, as it turned out, have any of those things for long. Her father's older brother, Silas Voss, arrived from Cheyenne within the month, produced a set of papers naming himself executor of what little estate remained, and informed his niece, without much apparent unease, that the house and the smithy's remaining equipment would be sold to satisfy debts she had not known her father carried, debts that, Adelia would only much later come to suspect, were considerably smaller than her uncle claimed. Silas was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He never raised his voice or his hand to her. He was simply a man who had decided, with the flat efficiency of someone balancing a private ledger of his own, that a grown, unmarried niece was an expense he had no obligation to carry, and he said so to her directly, on the porch, on the morning the auction notice went up, with his hat already settled on his head, and his horse already saddled for the road east. He left her $9, a sum he seemed to consider generous, and rode out of Larkspur without a backward glance, leaving Adelia standing in front of the only home she had ever known with a coat, a tin of tools too heavy to easily carry, and a dog who pressed himself against her leg as though he alone understood the size of what had just happened. She spent that first night in the hayloft above the livery stable, the owner having taken pity on her for the price of mucking his stalls, and it was there, staring up at the roof beams by lantern light with Copper curled against her side, that Adelia allowed herself, for perhaps the first time since her father's death, to feel the full weight of being entirely alone in the world. But she had inherited more from Tobias Voss than a coat and a set of blacksmith's tools. She had inherited his stubborn conviction that plain, discarded things were rarely as worthless as they appeared, and by morning that conviction had hardened, quietly, into something like a plan. She could not buy back her family's house. She could not undo her uncle's arithmetic, or bring her parents down off the hillside. But she still had $9, and Larkspur, in the wake of the mine's collapse, was full of abandoned things that no one else believed were worth even that much. The notice was tacked to the mercantile door alongside a dozen others: parcels of company land, a collapsed ore chute, a bunkhouse with a rotted roof. But it was the last line on the sheet that caught Adelia's eye. In the smallest print of all, the old powder magazine at the north edge of the claim, sold as is, sealed since closure, $4. She had walked past that magazine 100 times as a girl, a squat, windowless stone building set apart from the rest of the works by long-standing law, since a powder magazine that stood too near a town's houses was a powder magazine that could, in a single careless spark, take the houses down with it. It had been sealed the same week the mine closed, its heavy door bolted, and its lock left to rust, and no one in Larkspur had set foot inside it in the better part of a year. When Adelia asked the county land agent, a tired man named Grissom, who was clearly eager to be rid of unwanted parcels before he too left for better prospects, why the price sat so low, he told her plainly that no one wanted a stone box with no windows and a history of gunpowder, and that she would be a fool to want it either. She paid him her $4 anyway, signed her name where he pointed, and walked north out of town with Copper trotting ahead of her, his nose already lifted to the wind in a way she would only later understand had been, from that very first afternoon, a kind of warning and a kind of promise both at once. The magazine stood alone in a stand of scrub pine, its stone walls thick as a man's forearm, and mortared with the careful, overcautious skill of men who had understood exactly what they were building against. The iron door had rusted nearly shut, and it took the better part of an hour, and the borrowed help of the livery owner's crowbar, before Adelia finally forced it wide enough to slip inside, coughing on the stale, mineral-smelling air that had been sealed within for the better part of a year. The building was smaller inside than its walls suggested, a single square room lined floor to ceiling, with wooden powder racks, most of them empty, a few still holding rotted kegs, whose contents had long since been declared safe and useless by the closing inspectors. It was, by any honest measure, exactly the disappointing stone box Grissom had promised her. Adelia stood in the doorway that first evening, the low autumn sun slanting gold across the dusty floor, and felt something very close to despair settle over her, until Copper, who had slipped past her ankles the moment the door gave way, stopped dead in the room's far corner, and would not be called away from it. He stood with his nose pressed hard against the base of the rearmost powder rack, tail low and steady rather than wagging, his whole body gone taut with the particular stillness Adelia had learned, over 9 years, to trust more than almost anything else in the world. She had seen that stance before. The winter a rattlesnake had denned beneath the smithy floor. The summer a lost calf had wandered into a dry wash 2 ridges over. And she knew, even before she crossed the room to crouch beside him, that he was not simply sniffing at old wood. She ran her palm along the base of the rack where his nose was pressed, and found, beneath a skin of dust and cobweb, a seam in the stone flooring that did not match the mortared pattern of the rest of the room, a rectangle perhaps 2 feet by 3, its edges too straight and too deliberate to be anything but built. Her heart began to beat harder than the discovery, on its face, seemed to warrant. She pried at the seam with her fingers, until they ached, then fetched the crowbar from outside, and Copper did not move from her side the entire time, whining low in his throat with an urgency that felt, to her exhausted mind, almost like encouragement. The flagstone came up all at once, tipping back on a crude iron hinge that had clearly been set into the foundation by someone who meant it to be found again, someday, by the right person, and beneath it, Adelia found a shallow stone cavity, holding a single object, a strongbox, iron-banded and padlocked, small enough to fit inside a flour sack, and old enough that the padlock's hasp had rusted through on its own, so that the lid lifted at her first careful pull. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and gray with age, she found not gold, nor coin, nor anything a treasure hunter's imagination might have promised her, but paper, a thick, tightly bound ledger in a narrow, careful hand she recognized within the first 2 lines, because it was the same hand that had once shown a solemn 10-year-old girl how to read a column of honest numbers at her father's smithy table. It was Elias Thorne's hand, and the ledger, as Adelia would spend the coming days discovering by lamplight with Copper's chin resting warm against her knee, was not the Silver Star's public account book at all, but its true one, the wages the mine had actually owed its men across 9 years of operation, set down beside the far smaller sums Cornelius Wexler had actually paid, with the difference, quietly and meticulously totaled, running into thousands of dollars owed to nearly every family Adelia had grown up beside. The ledger's final pages, in ink noticeably fresher than the rest, told the deepening part of the story in Thorne's own careful words. He had discovered the discrepancy himself, 2 years before the mine's closure, in the ordinary course of reconciling the company's books, and had confronted Wexler privately, only to be told, in terms that left no room for negotiation, that the difference was company profit, and none of a bookkeeper's business, and that Thorne's continued employment depended on his continued silence. Thorne had not had the courage, or perhaps simply not the standing, to expose the theft outright to a town that trusted Wexler's company for its very existence. But he had not been willing either to let the truth vanish entirely. He had spent 2 years secretly copying the true figures by hand, a few lines at a time, from the company's real books, before they could be altered or destroyed, and when the mine's closure came suddenly upon them all, he had sealed the finished ledger, along with a note explaining what it was, and what it proved, inside the one place in Larkspur that no idle hand or company agent was ever likely to search, a powder magazine that everyone, including Wexler himself, considered too dangerous and too worthless to bother with. Thorne had died of a winter fever the same season as Tobias Voss, before he ever found the courage or the occasion to bring the ledger back into the light, and so his secret had waited, sealed in stone, for nearly a year, until a dog with a nose for hidden things led an orphaned girl to the one corner of a locked, forgotten room where it had been resting all along. For 2 days, Adelia told no one, not from any wish to hoard the discovery, but because the size of it frightened her. A document like this, in the wrong hands, might vanish as easily and completely as Elias Thorne himself had once feared. She read the ledger through by lamplight in her hayloft room. Copper stretched across her feet, and she recognized name after name in its columns. The Hendricks family, who had lost their second son to the same cave-in that killed her father, and had never once complained aloud about the meager burial allowance the company had sent. The widow Petrov, who took in washing now to feed 4 children on a fraction of what the ledger showed her husband had genuinely earned. Old Mr. Abernathy, who ran the mercantile on credit he could scarcely extend, because half the town owed him money, the mine itself had never fairly paid them. She understood, turning those pages, that she was not holding a fortune meant for herself alone. She was holding the missing half of nearly every family's history in Larkspur, and Copper, curled warm and watchful beside her, seemed, in his quiet animal way, to understand the weight of it too, resting his head across her arm each time her hands began to shake. She read by the thin, patient light of a single lamp, turned low to save oil, tracing each column with her fingertip, the way Thorne himself had once shown her at her father's smithy table, and the deeper she went into the ledger's careful pages, the more it became clear that this was not the work of a single angry afternoon, but of 2 full years of quiet, dangerous patience, entries copied a few lines at a time, in ink that shifted subtly in shade from page to page, evidence of a man returning again and again to a task he must have known could cost him everything if it were ever discovered. Some nights her hands shook too badly to hold the pages steady, and on those nights, Copper would rise from his place at the foot of the bed, and press his full weight against her side until the shaking passed, as though he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that the numbers themselves were a kind of grief that needed sitting with, rather than solving in a hurry. It did not take 2 full days for word to travel that the orphaned Voss girl had bought the old powder magazine, and been seen carrying something heavy, and rapped out of it after dark, and it took less than a week after that, for the news to reach a man Larkspur had believed gone from their lives for good. Bartholomew Wexler, Cornelius Wexler's only son, who arrived in town on the noon stage with a lawyer, a surveyor, and a story about wanting to see his late father's old mining claim one last time out of simple sentiment. Adelia did not believe the sentiment for a moment, and neither did Copper, who set up a low steady growl the very first time the younger Wexler's shadow crossed the mercantile porch where she stood, a reaction so unlike the dog's ordinarily gentle temperament, that half the street noticed it, and remembered it later. Bartholomew's true business became clear within days. A mining engineer traveling with his party let slip, over drinks at the saloon, that new survey methods had identified a rich secondary vein running beneath the very ground the old Silver Star claim occupied, one the original operation had never possessed the equipment to detect, and Bartholomew intended to quietly reacquire the abandoned claim, magazine and all, before anyone in Larkspur understood what the land beneath their ruined town might actually be worth. He came to Adelia directly on a gray afternoon, offering to buy the powder magazine back from her for $50, an absurd, almost insulting sum for a stone box he had, only a season earlier, considered too worthless to bother reclaiming, and a sum that told her, more plainly than any ledger could, exactly how much he suspected she had found inside it. When she refused, courteously but without hesitation, his manner cooled from practiced charm into something harder, and he reminded her, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his life needed to worry about county paperwork, that claim boundaries could be redrawn, that a young woman alone had few friends in a land office, and that Larkspur's remaining citizens, desperate as they were for any hint of the mine reopening and putting food back on their tables, would side with the promise of new wages over the word of an orphaned girl and her dog. It was not, strictly speaking, a threat. It was worse than a threat, because it was very nearly true, and Adelia walked home that evening, with her hands cold inside her coat pockets, understanding for the first time the full size of the fight in front of her. In the days after his visit, Bartholomew's pressure took quieter, more persistent forms than any open threat. A note left with the livery owner suggesting the magazine parcel's paperwork might not survive close county inspection. a passing remark to the mercantile crowd about how quickly a struggling town could talk itself out of a returning payroll if a single stubborn girl refused to be reasonable. Adelia felt the town's uncertain glances follow her down the main street those first mornings, felt the old easy nods from neighbors grow thinner and more hesitant, and understood that Bartholomew was gambling, correctly, on fear being a faster worker than truth. She did not fight it alone, and it was Copper, again, who showed her the shape her courage needed to take. In the days that followed, as Bartholomew Wexler's surveyor quietly remeasured the old claim lines, and his lawyer began making inquiries at the county office about magazine ownership and mineral rights, Adelia brought the ledger, page by careful page, to the people it named. She went first to the Hendricks family, then to the widow Petrov, then to old Mr. Abernathy at the mercantile, sitting at each kitchen table with Copper lying watchful across the doorway, as though standing guard over the conversation itself, and she showed them, in Elias Thorne's own honest handwriting, exactly how much the Silver Star had truly owed them across 9 years of labor. Grief and disbelief gave way, family by family, to something sturdier, not greed, but a plain righteous anger at having been quietly cheated by a company that had also, in the same stroke, let their husbands and sons work unshored passages that should never have been left unsafe. By the end of the week, Adelia was no longer a single orphaned girl, standing between Bartholomew Wexler and an old stone building. She was standing at the front of nearly every family Larkspur had left, all of them holding, for the first time, proof of exactly what had been taken from them. The reckoning came at a town meeting called in the schoolhouse on a night sharp with early frost. Bartholomew Wexler, seated at the front with his lawyer beside him, still insisting the old ledger was a forgery cooked up by a grieving, desperate girl looking to extort a settlement from an innocent family. It was Copper, in the end, who could not be argued with. When the lawyer demanded to know why anyone should trust that the ledger had truly come from the magazine, and not been fabricated afterward in Adelia's hayloft room, she asked the assembled town to walk with her, then and there, back out to the sealed building itself, and to watch her dog find the hidden cavity fresh, in front of every witness Larkspur could gather. Copper did not hesitate. He went straight to the same corner of the same rack, exactly as he had the first evening, whining and pawing until the flagstone was lifted again to reveal the shallow, empty cavity beneath it, a hollow no forger's hand could have quietly carved into solid mortared stone in secret, and every man and woman crowded into that cold room understood, watching a dog with no stake in any inheritance lead them unerringly to the same spot twice, that they were looking at the truth. Bartholomew Wexler's lawyer had no answer for a hound. Within the month, faced with a county land office now fully informed of his father's original wage theft, and the fresh survey his own engineer had let slip, Bartholomew abandoned his claim on the old Silver Star ground entirely, rather than risk the far larger legal reckoning that reopening the company's true books would surely bring down upon his family's name, and he left Larkspur on the same noon stage that had brought him, considerably poorer in reputation than he had arrived. There was no single triumphant moment when Larkspur's fortunes turned, only a slow, steady unhardening, the way a frozen creek gives way to spring not all at once, but in 100 small cracks widening at their own pace. The county land office, once it reviewed the ledger alongside the fresh survey Bartholomew's own engineer had unwittingly confirmed, moved with unusual speed to protect the town's claim, mindful of the scandal a second Wexler cover-up would bring down on its own record-keeping. The new vein, once properly surveyed and reopened under a cooperative arrangement the town itself negotiated, with Adelia, at Mr. Abernathy's insistence, holding a rightful share, as the one who had found the ledger and refused every bribe offered to bury it, began paying real, honestly recorded wages within the year, wages that finally settled, family by family, the debts Cornelius Wexler had left unpaid nearly a decade earlier. The Hendricks family repaired their roof before the first snow. The widow Petrov set down her washing basin for good, and opened a small bakery that would, within 2 years, be the sweetest smelling building on Larkspur's main street. Old Mr. Abernathy forgave every debt the mine's true wages could now cover, and posted, above his own counter, a framed copy of the ledger's final page, so that no one in town would ever again forget what honest accounting had cost, and restored. Adelia used her own share, in the end, not to leave Larkspur as her uncle once assumed she would, but to buy back, plank by plank, the very house she had been turned out of, and to reopen her father's smithy, under her own name, with a small brass plate by the door, reading simply Voss and Son, because she had decided, quietly, that the name deserved to keep going, even if the son it once described had not lived to see this particular forge lit again. She thought often, in those first months of rebuilding, of the sentence her father used to say over an unpromising lump of iron, that the world was too quick to throw away what merely looked plain, and she understood now that he might as well have been speaking of a sealed stone magazine nobody wanted, or of an orphaned girl with $9 and a dog, or of the dog himself, red-coated and ordinary-looking, who had never once been trained to find anything, and who had found, anyway, the one thing an entire town needed most. Copper lived out his years exactly as he had lived them before the discovery, curled at Adelia's feet in the smithy each evening, walking beside her cart on market days, greeting every child in Larkspur by name with the same solemn dignity he had always carried, entirely unaware, in his own quiet animal way, that he had once stood at the hinge point of a whole town's fortunes, and simply followed his nose, because that was what faithful dogs do. Larkspur remembers him still. There is a bench outside the Mercantile, carved with a running hound, where old-timers say a person can sit and feel, on certain evenings, that the town's luck was never really buried in silver at all, but in the plain, overlooked, and entirely faithful things that everyone else had simply stopped looking for. And that, we think, is the truest shape of the story we set out to tell you tonight, not of gold, hidden in a stone box, but of value hiding, all along, in the places and the creatures the world had already decided to write off. A 20-year-old girl with $9 was not worth much to her uncle's ledger. A windowless powder magazine was not worth much to a tired land agent. A stray shivering pup under a porch in a blizzard was not worth much to anyone passing by. And yet it was precisely these three discarded, underestimated things, the girl, the building, the dog, that together restored an entire town's stolen wages and its stolen trust, proving, as Tobias Voss always believed at his forge, that the measure of a thing is never in how little it costs at first glance, but in what it is quietly built to hold. Thank you for spending this evening with us, and with Adelia and Copper. If their story stayed with you the way it stayed with us, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who still believes in quiet, overlooked kindness, and we'd love to hear your answer to this. If you found a sealed, forgotten place tomorrow, what do you imagine it might be quietly waiting to give back to the people around you? Until next time, stay close.